Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fusion 360 Live Tech Thursday. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk, and this is part 3 of creating this assembly where we were doing the in-context design of creating all of these parts where they need to be. And we're actually going to finish this thing up today, and I will show you how to do the exploded view. I'll show you how to animate it, etc. So before we get started, a couple things. You might have noticed that this live stream is an hour earlier. So we've made some decisions to actually move these back an hour. So they'll be at the 12 o'clock Mountain time frame instead of the 1 o'clock Mountain time frame. And we're also going to minimize them just a little bit. We're going to do 1 a week instead of 2 a week. And I know some of you are like, oh, but we love all your stuff. We want to give you guys the best content that we can. And by doing 1 a week, that's going to allow us to create some even better live streams for you. We do read all of the comments. And for example, I just looked over at the chat and somebody said, I'm eager to learn some new undocumented tips and tricks. Well, that's actually an upcoming live stream. I'm going to share a lot of these tips that I have spread throughout a whole bunch of these live streams. We're going to consolidate them into one live stream for you so you can learn all these cool little tips and tricks. So definitely make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure you hit that little bell icon. That'll notify you when the next live stream is happening. And just keep an eye out on our Fusion 360 webpage. We're going to try and advertise a little bit more about when these are going to be coming out. The second thing I wanted to remind you all about is the upcoming Fusion 360 Academy happening in Portland. You've heard us talk about this a lot. We're really excited about it. Hundreds of customers are coming, and we just found out that we're going to have a new guest speaker, which is going to be this guy. Adam Savage is coming, and yes, I have a man crush on him. I can't wait to meet him. We're doing book signings and stuff like that with him. So if you can, I highly recommend coming to the Fusion 360 Academy. I know Aaron is helping me out today. He'll probably throw a link out there if you want some more information about how to do that. The next thing I want to do is give a shout out. And I'm going to shout out to Amphori Consulting. And this is actually quite funny because in part 2, we were showing how to do all these threads. And in fact, I'll bring up the screen here so you can see it. We had all these threads on here, and somebody in the chat said, well, is there an easy way to convert them from the decaled threads to actual modeled threads? And we were like, oh, that'd be kind of cool if you could do that. And Amphori put in the chat, well, you can. And it's actually right here. And I didn't even know this. Under the document settings, if you expand that open, if you have threads in your design, this will show up. If you don't have threads in your design, this won't be in there. And you'll notice this little icon right here, change the thread type. And right now it's set to cosmetic, which means they're just like a decal. And if I change this to modeled and say OK, it's a quick way of converting all of your threads to be modeled threads, and or the other way around, all your modeled threads to be cosmetic threads. So Amphori, shout out to you, 2 thumbs up. Even some of my other coworkers, they were like, what? I didn't know you could do that. So we learn from all of you. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with everybody else on these live streams. I love that. Nothing makes me happier. So great job. Okay, let's go ahead and dive right in. So we're almost done with this thing. Let me go ahead and turn the bracket back on. The only thing we have left to model is this pulley up here, and then a couple of washers and this nut and the woodruff key. So I'm going to go through and show how I would go about modeling this. And you're going to learn a couple new tips and tricks. That's my forte. I like sharing those with you. So let's jump into the pulley drawing. Okay, as I take a look at this, we can kind of see, again, it's a pretty symmetrical part. But I'm going to zoom up on this area here, and it's kind of hard to see, but there's like some filleted edges here, some filleted edges in here, and you'll notice that I have this little crosshair looking kind of a thing. And this is actually a edge extension. So you can see that icon right there is an edge extension. So what I did is I extended this straight line here and this straight angled line there, and that's what the dimensions are going to. So you can kind of see that exists in multiple areas here. So I'm going to basically build this profile, and because it's symmetrical across and symmetrical vertically, we're going to use some easy commands like the mirror command to help us out. Now I would say this is probably one of the more complicated parts in the design, except for the frame, I would say. So let's go ahead and walk through how I'm going to do this. I'm going to use the dimensions from this drawing to help me out. Okay, like I've shown previously, I can come in here and right click on my top level and say I want to create a new component. So I'm going to come in here and say new component, and it automatically creates a component in there instead of having to go up to the assemble menu and select new component. The next thing I like to do is kind of like just double click on it to rename it, and I'll call this pulley. You'll notice I've named all my parts. I really like to name my parts so that way it's easy to find them when I want to turn them on or off. Okay, I'll create a sketch. I'm going to draw it on this front plane, and let's just zoom up here a little bit. Now this whole series has been about in-context design, using information from pre-existing models to help us with our new model. And we've been using the project command quite a bit. And again, we're going to use it. So I'm going to say project. And I want to grab maybe the information from this bushing and maybe from this shaft here. Now I don't need the whole shaft, so I'm going to go ahead and just do specified entities, and maybe I'll just click on that particular shaft there. So I just get that portion because I don't need anything over here or any of this over here. So again, these two options are specified entities. That allows me to pick an individual thing like an edge or a face. And the other one is bodies, where it actually will project almost like a silhouette of the whole body. So you'll notice how it's kind of highlighting all the way around. Okay, so I've got those two lines. Now I'm going to create some symmetry. So I know I want to go straight across, and all I have to do is get kind of near. I guess I didn't project it. Let me make sure I projected that. Say okay. I forgot to say okay. There we go. Get near this edge, and you'll see how it kind of snaps to the center. I see that little triangle, and that means midpoint. That's my midpoint constraint. So all I have to do is get kind of near the center and click. I'll come over here and get near the center and click, and you can kind of see how I've just drawn a line all the way across this opening. And I'll do the same thing here. I get near the center, you can kind of see it snap into place. I'm just going to go ahead and draw a line straight up. I don't care how far. These are going to be my light pencil lines. Okay, so I could come in here and select both of those, and I want to convert those to construction geometry. So they turn dashed, and you'll notice they're like light pencil lines now. Okay. So using the drawing, I'm going to basically just offset some lines to give me some locations. So I'm going to use all of these dimensions to help me out with that. So I used the term offset, so we're going to use the offset command. Under the modify menu, you'll see offset, or O is the shortcut key. And gave me an error because I don't have anything selected. I'll go ahead and select that horizontal edge, and you can see that it's going to offset that line. Now I can type in the distance. So the first one is 7/8, so I'm going to type in 7/8, and you'll see that it took that line and offset it 7/8. Okay. Now here's a trick I use every so often. If I right mouse click, you'll notice I get this blue like radar. This is what we call our marking menu. And you'll notice at 12 o'clock is the repeat the last command. And in this case, the last command I did was an offset. If I had done a circle, it would say repeat circle. If I had done an extrude, it would say repeat extrude. But you'll notice this black line that's kind of stretched out from there. This is, again, called the marking menu. And the black line is what we call a gesture. So all I have to do, you'll notice if I go to the left, it's an undo. If I go to like 2 o'clock, it's press pull. So all I have to do is, I'm just in my workspace right now, I'm just going to right click and drag straight up, and you're going to see it's going to repeat the last command, which was offset. So instead of having to go to the menu over and over again, all I have to do is, I've done my offset, I just have to right click straight up, and I get my offset command again. So I'll go ahead and say that one needs to be 15 sixteenths. Okay. And so I've just offset it 15 sixteenths. I'll right drag straight up again, and it's going to do the offset again. Okay. So let me go ahead and do the next one, which is 1 5 sixteenths. And I showed this earlier, that you can do, fractions in here. Again, I don't have it, somebody else shared with me a tip where I typed in like 2 divided by 3 divided by 4, and it actually worked, and I was kind of surprised. And he explained, well, that's because that's how math works. So again, I can't remember who did that. I think it was Ekram, if I'm not mistaken, so thank you. So let me go ahead and right click again to repeat my offset. So I'm just basically creating some lines. So let's go 1 3/8 from the drawing, and then let's do one more straight up, 1 5/8. So you can kind of see we're starting to get these lines here. Well, I also know, so I basically typed in all these dimensions. So I've got like this point, this point, this point here, this point here, and the overall height. We can see that there's a 1/2 inch wide beam through the middle, so let's go ahead and do that. So I'll say offset. Now you'll notice in this example it kind of offset to the left in the positive direction. I'm going to drag to the right, and it says negative, so I'm going to make sure I need to type in negative 0.25 because I'm doing half of an inch. Okay, so I've got a lot of geometry here now. Okay. These are all object lines, and I want to convert them to construction lines. So I could just draw a crossing window across all of those lines like so, and say construction. And notice that we've turned all of those into construction geometry. Now I'm going to share that tip in my upcoming tips and tricks, but basically what it is if you draw a window from left to right, it's only going to select what's fully inside that window. So you'll notice it didn't select any of those lines because they're not fully inside. Now if I came down like this, it'll select some of the stuff. But if I drag from right to left, it's a crossing, and anything crossing that window gets selected. So kind of a cool tip. So you're getting some preview tips here. Okay. So now I want to, again, make sure I've projected this geometry. So I'm going to hit the P key, and I want to project this particular surface there. And you can see I now have an object line that I can catch to. So I have enough stuff, I can start to draw. So I'm going to zoom up just so you can kind of see a little bit better what's going on here. So we're going to start at the top of this flange and go straight up to this line. Okay, then I'm going to click again and come over to this intersection here. Come up to this intersection here. Come over to this intersection here, and you'll notice something as I kind of finishing this up. Let me just bring this over to there. This is actually inside, and this one sticks out a little bit further. And again, that's according to the drawing. You can kind of see that here, how this is inset a little bit from this edge over here. Okay, now I only drew half of this, and you'll notice that it's not shaded in, which means it's not a valid profile. I would have to close this profile. I'd have to draw a line down and across, or I guess there's already one across. So if I drew a line down, you would see that this would then turn into a valid profile, okay, because it's closed now. Well, I'm going to undo. I'm going to leave that open. I need to recreate this on the other side. Now I could trace over everything again, but I took some time doing this. Let's let the software do the hard work for me. So I'm going to come in here and say, create a mirror. And I'm just going to draw a box around my profile, something like this. Okay. What's my mirror line? Well, this middle line right here is my mirror line. So I'll click on that. You can kind of see it gives me a preview of what that looks like. And when I say OK, you can see how that has fully shaded in. And so we know that that's a valid profile. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and finish my sketch. Let's zoom up here a little bit. And like I said, this was probably one of the more complicated ones. It was basically because we had to create a bunch of light pencil lines to help give us our profile that we needed to trace over. So now I'll come into my Create menu, and instead of doing an extrusion, we want to revolve around an axis. So I'll say revolve. What's my profile? I'm just going to go ahead and select on my profile. What's my axis? I'm just going to come in here and select that center axis, like so, and it gives me a cool preview of what that's going to look like. You can tell it to go, 180 degrees if you wanted to, and you can kind of see what that looks like. But obviously in this case, we want to go the full distance, so we're going to say 360, and I'll say OK. Now, we designed it exactly where it needs to be, but I need to work on the inside of this, and it's kind of hard to see. Some of the stuff's in the way. So I like to right-click on it and say Isolate. And what that does is it basically turns off all of my other parts. Now I'm working on this by itself. According to the drawing, let me zoom out here, it says radius of 1/8 for all fillets. And we can see that there's some on the outside here and a couple on the inside. So let's go ahead and do that. So here's my, my first tip I want to share with you that I really like. I'm going to go into my fillet command. And typically you would have to select these edges. So I'm going to say that edge there, that edge there, that edge there. I'm going to have to rotate a little bit and click that edge there. Then I'm going to have to do the same thing over on this side. And that could take some time selecting all of those edges. Well, here's the neat tip. I'll say fillet, and instead of selecting edges, I'm going to select a face. I'll type in 0.125 and notice that it fillets the edges that have to do with that face. In fact, if I come in and select this face here, watch what happens. It actually fillets those two edges. So instead of clicking like 8 or 12 times or whatever, I'm just clicking a couple. So boom, oops, not that guy. I want that guy. And I'm all done with my fillets. Let me say OK, and we can see those nice fillets on the inside and nice fillets on the outside. So a lot of people think you can only fillet an edge, but if you select face, it'll select both of those edges or all of the edges on the face. So just like that, we're actually done with this part. So spent some time creating the construction geometry, then we revolved it, and then we did the fillets. Now, I've mentioned this multiple times on previous live streams. I like to keep my sketches simple and let Fusion do the hard work. So for example, in my profile, in my sketch profile, I didn't do any 2D fillets. I left those as sharp edges, and then I added them as 3D fillets. And the reason for that is it allows you to come back and make quick changes. So instead of 0.125, I want them to be 0.0625 or something like that. And instantly we've changed all of those fillets instead of having to go to a sketch and modify all those 2D fillets. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, I isolated this. If I right click on it, I can say unisolate, and you'll see that all of my other parts come back. So we've finished with the pulley. Let's go to the drawing and see what the next drawing is. So the next drawing is a washer. Now, again, we're going to do this in context. I have this dimension, but we're actually not going to type in a single dimension to create this washer. So I know where it needs to go. The pulley is kind of in the way. So I'm going to come in here and say new component. I'll call it washer. I'm going to turn the little light bulb off next to the pulley, and you can see now the pulley is turned off. Well, I know I want to create a washer that touches that face and touches that face there. That's the diameter of this circle. So it's literally this easy. Check this out. I click on the face, I right click, and I say create sketch. Now Fusion automatically projects the 2D geometry for me, so I'm actually done. All I have to do now is say finish sketch. I didn't even have to project because it did it for me automatically. We can see that right there. I'll right click and say extrude. How far do we need to extrude? Well, I want to extrude to that face, and sure enough we can see that's 1/8 of an inch, or 0.125. I'll say okay, and we just created a washer that's the correct size and fits where it needs to fit. Now if I wanted to, here's another tip, I could click on that edge and it tells me what the radius is, or I could inspect and click on that edge and it'll tell me what the radius and the diameter. So I can see that sure enough that's 1.875 or 1/7/8, right? So just to confirm, that's good. Now I could do the same thing over here, but why create extra steps? Let's just use the mirror command. Now I don't want to mirror faces, I want to mirror actual components. I want to mirror the washer component. So I'll click on components. What's the component that guy is? What's my mirror plane? When I click on that, it brings up my origin, and I want to make sure I'm going to click on this plane right here, and you can see it gives me a nice preview. I'll say okay, and I now have another component called washer with mirror next to it. Okay, so we're done with the washers. Let's see what the next one is. So the next one is this nut, and you'll notice I put in big bold text, this is a McMaster car item, and I give the actual number. And I've shown how to bring in McMaster car components in previous live streams, but this time we're actually going to search for a particular one. So I'm going to come in here and I'll make my top level active, like so. Maybe we'll turn the pulley back on so we can kind of see what it looks like. I'm going to come in here and say insert McMaster car component. Oops. Let me move this guy up a little bit and stretch it out. Okay, so I've shown in the past where I'm going to do something different. I'll say washers and flat washers, and you can specify the size and all that kind of stuff. Well, instead, you can actually search if you know the McMaster car number. So, for example, 938-39A 832. I'm going to go ahead and search for that, and you can see that it actually found it in the catalog right here, and it opened it up for me, and sure enough we can see it's a high strength thin hex nut, and if it has this little CAD symbol next to it, I can click on that product detail and save it. So I want to save it as a step file. I'll hit save. And after a moment, it brings it right into our design. And you'll notice it brought it into the 000 location. and it's not facing the right direction, but this is pretty easy to fix. I'm just going to drag it out here in space. I like to get it sort of close to where it needs to go. And I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. So let's just rotate it 90 degrees. You can see that right there. Now, again, multiple different ways to position this. I could create a joint, I could align it, or I'm just going to move it into the correct location. And we've been dynamically dragging. We've been grabbing these arrows. That's one way to do it. I can translate, I can rotate, but I can also move point to point. So I'm going to say point to point. What's the origin? I'm going to zoom up on here, and you'll notice when I click on this circular face, it allows me to pick that little center mark, and it's kind of hard to see because it's blue. Let me rotate a little bit more. There you go. So you can kind of see this little center mark right here. So I'm going to say that's where I want to move from. And I'll kind of rotate a little bit. I'll hover over this face and you can see the little center mark right there in the middle. And that's where I want to move it to. And it's going to move that nut where it needs to go. I'll say OK. And I'm happy with that. That looks really good. So I'm going to capture that position into my timeline. And I didn't have to model that nut. So, really quick way of positioning things. Now, this has, I could pull that off, right? I just said move it from one location to the other. I did not build a joint or anything like that. We're going to get to that here in a moment. But it's a quick way of positioning things from one location to the other. Okay, looking at our drawing, the next thing we need to do is... Actually, the last thing we need to do is to create this woodruff key. Okay, so again, I'm going to design it in context. So I know the woodruff key belongs on the shaft, so I'm going to activate the shaft, and I'll probably go ahead and isolate it. Keeps things simple. Okay. I want to create a new component. Now watch what happens. Right here on shaft, if I right mouse click and say new component, it's actually going to create another component underneath the shaft. So I've always been kind of doing it up at this top level, and they've all been at the same level. But this time I right clicked on shaft and I said new component. And so basically the shaft is going to own this woodruff key. Okay. I'll go ahead and create a sketch. We'll do it on this front plane. I want to grab information, so I'm going to hit P for project. We need to project some geometry. I could do the whole thing, but I want to grab this circular item, and you'll notice it's not highlighting. It's kind of doing a silhouette all the way around. So I'm going to say selection filter, and I can be more specific. In fact, I can rotate and I can grab that curved face right there, and it projected that woodruff key seat for me. You'll also notice it shows me where the center of that circle is. So let's go ahead and just create a circle there, click there, and I could see that that was, I went too fast, let me do that one more time. I could see that that was 3/4 of an inch, as that snapped into place, 0.75. Okay. I'll say finish sketch. And I want to, oops, actually I shouldn't have finished sketch. I need to add one more line in here. So I'll say line, I'm just going to click on this edge and this edge here. Add in a dimension according to the drawing that this line is 1/16 of an inch below the center of the circle. And you can kind of see how that moved down a little bit. So there we go. Okay, now here's something I've shown in the past. When I want to extrude this, you'll notice it's only selecting that profile, but I need to add in this profile down here, but it's not letting me. So all I have to do is click and hold for about a second, and it allows me to probe through until I can get to the profile. So here's the outside face, there's the inside of the woodruff key seat face. There's my profile. So now I have both of those selected. extrude. Okay, now obviously I want to go symmetric, so I'm going to say symmetric. And I know that the whole length is 1/8 of an inch, so I can say 1/8, and there is our woodruff key in the woodruff seat. Okay, let's go ahead and show all components. And I might even activate the very top. So I've completed, according to my drawing, I've completed all of the individual components. What I like to do is I like to do an analysis, so like a section analysis. Under the Inspect menu, I'll say Section Analysis. And I kind of investigate, take a look at what's going on here. So now you'll see that I have a little bit of clashing going on here because these are not actually threaded. Okay, we'll get to that here in a moment. So that's okay because these pins are going to be threaded and fit into the threaded holes. But as I zoom up here, I notice my woodruff key looks kind of weird, like it's sitting inside this part right here. So I'll go ahead and cancel out, and let's take a look at that. Let's go ahead and turn off the pulley, and let's turn off these washers, and let's turn off the let's do the shaft. We'll turn on, no, let's leave the shaft on. Now I forgot what this part's called, so I'm just going to click on it. It tells me it's the bushing, so I can turn off the bushing. And I notice that I don't actually have a woodruff key slot for that woodruff key to slide through. I've got the groove in the shaft. Oops, let me turn off the frame. But I don't have the shaft. I actually forgot. So when I was creating this particular component here, you can see right there it says a 5/32 by 5/64 keyway. And I must have forgotten to model that in when we created this design. So that is one of the key reasons I like to do my section analysis. It really gives me a visual representation of what's correct. Like this looks really good over here, and what's incorrect, and we can see that right there. Now you might say, oh, you could just subtract that out, but we actually need a groove in there. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'll turn off my analysis. I know that that's on the frame, so I'm going to activate my frame. Excuse me. And I'll go ahead and isolate that. Let me grab a quick drink. Okay, now as I rotate around, sure enough, we can see that there is no keyway in there like there should be. So, easy fix. My frame component is active. I can see all of the steps that were required to create that frame. I'm just going to go ahead and create a sketch, and I like to do it a little bit isometric like this. And again, you'll notice that it projected that geometry for me. So I should be able to come in here and say rectangle, and I'm going to use the center rectangle, but you'll notice that it's not like snapping or anything like that to the very center of this circle. So I need to add a little bit of extra geometry in here. So here's the center of the circle. I'm just going to draw a line. Okay, oops, let me move so you can see this. I like to convert it to a construction line. Another tip somebody shared in the chat on the last session, which I thought was great. I love it when you guys do that. I'm coming over here to the menu and hitting construction, but you can also hit X, like X-ray, on your keyboard. So you can toggle between an original line or a construction line just by using the X key. Okay, now let's do the rectangle. Center rectangle, and now you can see it snap to that edge of the circle and to that line. I know that the overall width, let me bring up my drawing here. I already forgot what the dimensions were. I think it was a 5/32. So 5 30 seconds. Okay. And the keyway is supposed to be 5/64. Well, I'm going to do 5 30 seconds because I'm doing half and half basically. So I'll just do that. I'll say finish. Let's go ahead and grab this profile and extrude it. Now, here's another tip. Again, I saw this in the chat. Like I said, we do read all of your comments, and we actually learn from some of the comments that you guys talk about, like tips and tricks and stuff like that, and I'm actually sharing those with you. So I typically, drag and snap to a face. So I'll come in here and snap to that face, and it'll extrude to that face, and that works. But we also have other options. We have distance, to object, and then all. Okay. Now, if I say to object, and then I click on this face, it kind of looks like the exact same thing where I just dragged and snapped to that face. But why this is actually better is because if we were to change down the road, change the width of this feature here, this slot has to always touch this face because of this. And so it will always look correct. If I came in here and said distance, and I just clicked on this face, it's snapping to it. It's not building any kind of relationship or anything like that. So in reality, I should be saying to object. And I think that's a very valid tip. It will help down the road if you come back and make changes. Now the other one is to say all. And Fusion is smart enough, because I'm going this direction, it's not going to blow through here. But you need to be careful that if you say all, it could go through more stuff than you want it to. It's basically infinite, okay? So be a little bit careful with that, but it's pretty useful also. So I'm going to say to object, say OK, and it's going to create that key slot through there. So let's go ahead and turn everything back on. I'll say show all components. Let's turn on our analysis, and now we can kind of see what that looks like. Okay. Maybe my keyway is not tall enough. Must not be. I need to check my drawing, but so I can see it's clearing, but not enough. So maybe I need to check my dimensions. So I apologize, but again, this is why I turn on the analysis. Okay, to confirm. So I could go back to my frame. Let's isolate it. Sorry. Oh, I guess it's let me unisolate and then isolate that again. So I say isolate, it turns everything off. So I could come back to my sketch and make a change to that. So maybe I have the dimension wrong, I don't know. But I'm not going to fix that right now because I want to finish showing the other stuff. So let's fix this guy, let's turn him back on and show all of our components. Okay. Now I should save because I've finished everything, and I could say finished. I could come in here and add a comment. I could say check woodruff key dimensions or something like that. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Check woodruff key. And I could post this, and it's going to save this into that particular version. So I could come back and say, oh, there's a note here, I need to check that. Sure enough, I need to fix that woodruff key area. Okay. Now I've got my parts all done, but if I grab on them, you'll see that they all move individually. Okay, I have not built any relationships. However, because they're all in the right location, I can use the as built joints. And this is probably one of my favorite commands. I think it's so powerful. Now, what I have to do before I do that is we have to tell which part we want to be stationary, which part is grounded or held in place. And this is going to be the part that's bolted down to the ground and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this part here, and it tells me that's the bracket. And if I right click, I can say ground. And you'll notice it puts a little pin icon on there. Okay. Now if I drag any of these other parts, they can move around. However, if I try and drag on this bracket, you'll notice it can't move. It's grounded in place. Okay. So let's go ahead and do an as-built joint. It's asking for the components. So I'm going to say this component here and this component here. And you can see how it kind of shakes a little bit. It says, oh, that's a rigid joint. Well, we want it to be a revolute joint. And if I move my cursor, you'll notice it says select reference. And it's basically asking, what do you want to revolve around? Well, I can click any circular edge or face or anything like that. It really doesn't matter. But I'm just going to go ahead and maybe click on that edge there, and you'll see it gives me a preview of what that looks like. Okay, so I didn't have to go from one point to another or anything like that. I just said this part and this part revolve around that edge. And if I were to grab the frame and move it, you can kind of see how that simulates what that would look like. Okay. Now we notice that none of the parts up here are moving. Well, I want this to be basically one solid assembly, so I'm going to come in here and say rigid group. And what are the components? Well, I want the shaft, the bushing, the pulley, the two washers, and the nut. So I'm going to basically select all of those and say I want those to be rigid with the frame. So now when I say OK, and I move that frame, you can see how all of those parts move together. And that is the power of using these as-built joints. So we can show how this thing would actually work if it was attached to a truck or something, and there's a strap that goes around this or whatever. Now I could also come in here and say I want to build an as-built joint. I want this component to revolve around like the shaft, or I could even say around this component. It says a joint already exists. Do you want to continue? I'll say yes. And we're just going to revolve it around a circular edge. Now you can't really see it because there's no reference, but it's actually rotating around. So even though I grouped those all together as a rigid group, I kind of said I actually want this part to revolve around. I'll say OK, and now they all work together, but I can also revolve this guy around if need be. Okay, so the last thing I want to show in this part 3 is how did I create this image here? How did I do this exploded view? Now I've done a live stream in the past on the animation workspace. So this is going to basically be a review of the animation workspace. So I'm just going to jump over here and switch to my animation workspace. Now we have automatic explode, like auto explode. I don't find that it works all that great. Oops, I need to select my components first of all. Let me just click this guy and say auto explode all levels, and it will extrude or explode. You can kind of see it just kind of goes out wherever it wants. It sort of did a pretty good job, but these kind of went in that direction. So I like to do a manual explode. And I could come in here and say manual explode. I pick my parts and I can tell it which direction I want to explode. So I want that part to go up. And I want that part to explode up. I want the shaft. Let me make sure I can click on it. Might have to turn some components off. I'll say I want the washer to explode up, that washer to explode up, and then I might say I want this bracket to explode down, that pin to explode to the right, and that pin to explode to the left. Okay, so I basically told it which way I want these to go, and now when I start to drag, you'll see that it will explode in those directions. Okay? However, I still don't like what this looks like. So what I tend to do is I just use regular transform components, and that can specify which ones I want to change. Okay? So I'm going to say transform components, and I'll just say I want this pin to go off to the left. Okay? I'll repeat my last command. I want, I can clear this guy out. I want this guy to go to the right. Now, I'm usually more careful. I might go the exact same distance. You know, this went 3 and that goes 3, just to keep things consistent, right? Then I might grab this guy and say I want to move him down 2 inches in this case. Okay? Then I might come in here and say transform, and I'm just going to grab a bunch of these. Let's do that guy, that guy. In fact, I can even select it from here. I also want the bushing, which is hidden in there. I want the, I think I already got the nut. I want the washer. And I want the shaft to move all at the same time. So I'm just going to go ahead and move that up like so. Say OK. And I moved all of those as a group. Then I can come in and say, okay, well, let's move the nut way over here. And let's move the woodruff key and the shaft, hopefully. Oh, it's the, because I did the subassembly there, it's moving them together, so I can do something like that and say okay. Maybe I want to move them a little bit more, so I'll grab those and this washer and slide those off to the left a little bit. And then finally I might do the oops, sorry, wrong icon. Move, I'll grab that guy and the bushing. Let's slide him off to the right. And then I'll transform just the washer. And again, a little bit more steps, but I have a lot more control over what this thing kind of looks like. And that's why I like kind of doing it manually. Let me go ahead and transform. Let me see if it'll let me do the woodruff key. I'm just going to drag that up a little bit. And I'll say okay. Okay, so here is my exploded view. Now it only takes 1 second to do that. If I were to drag this to the left, you can kind of see how everything is exploding out or whatever. I could stretch all of these out, you know, to be like 6 seconds long, and it would take, you know, obviously longer for that to happen or whatever. Now I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but now you can kind of see how it's taking longer for those pins to come out. Everything else is exploded already, and then finally the pins explode out. Okay, the last thing I want to show, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's call it, I'll say animation. Call that good. I'm going to switch back to my regular design, and I'm going to create an exploded view on my drawing. Now, typically an isometric looks kind of like this, right? It's kind of that 45, 45, 60 or whatever it is. I can't remember from my drafting days. I might want it to be a little bit more kind of like this. So here's a neat tip. I'll open up my named view, right click and say new named view. And you can see that it added a named view in there. So I could say top, front, and let's go to this named view, and that's going to be that semi-isometric that I like. In fact, I'll go ahead and rename this. I'll call it Brad's ISO. Okay. Okay. Now when I go to create a drawing of this, I'll come in here and say drawing from design, or I could say from animation. So I'm going to say from animation, and there we go. It's using our storyboard. I can specify what sheet size. Let's just do a D size. I'll say okay. And it's going to ask for, it'll give me like a little thumbnail here in just a little bit. So here's that predefined ISO that I don't really like. In this case, orientation home. I could say show me my front view, and it's going to show me an exploded of my front, like top, etc. But notice Brad's ISO. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to be at that exact direction that I had captured in my named view. So I can go ahead, I want that to be, let's just say shaded. I'll say okay. And there is my exploded view in the direction that I want. I could also come in here and say base view. And notice I now have a closed or assembled view. So let's go ahead and do Brad's ISO again. And I'll do a 1:1. Say okay. Now notice what it looks like. I could edit that view. I want it also to be shaded and all my tangent edges to be displayed. And then finally I could come in and add a table to that view there. I'll place it, and it automatically numbered it for me. Now the numbers kind of go into my table a little bit, so I might move these views down. Let me just move this guy down a little bit. There we go. And it lists my part numbers and has balloons and all of them. And I can move these around. I can reassociate where the arrowhead points on the particular object, for example. I could move this guy over here and this guy over here. So you can create some really nice looking exploded views. I can even come in, showing a lot of tips here, I could even come in and say renumber. And I want that to be number 1. Now watch what happens to my table when I do this. It's pretty cool. That's number 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see how the table is actually updating. 9, 10. There we go. So it's in the correct numerical order. Okay, so that is the end of part 3 of this 3-part series. I hope you learned something about in-context design. This is how I design. When I'm creating stuff, I like to start with a part and then use that part to help me design the next part that's attached to it. So you don't have to do it this way, but it is one of the methods, and hopefully you saw the power behind it. Make sure you hit a thumbs up if you like this, if you learned anything. Make sure you leave comments in on the YouTube video. We like the chat, but we also like to read the comments that you leave on the video. So make sure you do that if you have any comments or topics or anything you'd like to see. Aaron, thanks again for helping answer the chat, and hope to see you on a future live stream. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.